It was a deal that brought a once ostracised country into the global fold, a promise of reduced nuclear activity in return for the lifting of sanctions. Iran appears to be keeping to the terms of its historic nuclear agreement. But could President Trump scupper what he says is the worst deal ever? This is Roundtable with me, David Foster. A pass to the free world and a move out of the shadows towards international acceptance. Reasons enough, you might think, for Iran to agree to reduce its nuclear program. A pact of peace, enterprise and mutual, that being the operative word, benefits. The chance for Iran to rebuild its economy and for investors unfettered access to its untapped markets. But is US President Donald Trump on track to derail all of that?
In Trump's America, Iran is once again public enemy.
Iran must never be allowed to possess a nuclear weapon. Never, ever.
Years of work that the Obama administration put in to strike the nuclear deal with Iran now looks like it could be under threat. But is this just the Trump bravado that we've become familiar with? Or does he have a clear strategy to deal with Tehran? It took 600 days of intense marathon negotiations, but in the end, the nuclear deal was hailed as a landmark agreement. For Tehran, it promised an easing of crippling sanctions. For the US and the EU, a guarantee that Iran couldn't make a nuclear bomb. It was also a defining moment for Obama. He thought he'd brought Tehran to heel, but Trump doesn't think so.
They are not living up to the spirit of the agreement, I can tell you that. And we're analyzing it very, very carefully, and we'll have something to say about it in the not too distant future.
A day later, the US slapped fresh sanctions on Tehran, the third time this year, even though Congress said Iran was upholding its part of the deal. Trump remains deeply suspicious of Tehran's motives. He says they support terror organizations and that ballistic missile tests carried out earlier this year threatened regional stability. But there are voices in Europe that want more engagement. By some estimates, Iran could add $1 trillion to its GDP over the next 2 decades. For some European businesses, tapping the Iranian economy is a no-brainer. Earlier this month, French energy giant Total signed a $5 billion deal with Tehran to develop one of its offshore gas fields. Airbus wants to sell 100 new planes to national carrier Iran Air, a deal worth $20 billion. There's talk of disagreement and disarray in the White House over its Iran policy. Trump said he would rip up the nuclear deal. For now at least, it looks like that isn't going to happen. But the mixed messages are presenting a dilemma for him. Scuttling the deal would complicate relations with Europe, and some leaders there already seem ready to do business with Tehran.
So could Donald Trump pose a threat to the Iran deal? Joining me at today's roundtable from Washington, Fred Fleitz, former CIA analyst. Here in the studio, Paul Ingram, Executive Director of the British American Security Information Council. He says the deal is working and could lead to better relations between the US and Iran. Clemente Capellos, to my left, founder and chief executive of Sturgeon Capital. His company was one of the first to make financial inroads into Iran and launched its Iran Fund in 2015. And we have Hossein Rassam, senior editor at the television news channel Iran International. Welcome all of you to today's roundtable. Mr. Fleitz, let me come to you in Washington first. When you were a CIA analyst, you specialized in weapons analysis. Is there anything that you've seen since the deal was signed to suggest that Iran is now in any better position to pursue its nuclear program than it was before, and therefore lead to the fears of Donald Trump?
Yeah, I do indeed, and it's great to be here. Those people who say that this agreement is working, I would agree it is working for Iran. Iran is continuing to enrich uranium with over 5,000 centrifuges. It is developing advanced centrifuges. It has cheated on the agreement, according to German intelligence. It is doing everything necessary to advance its nuclear program to establish an industrial-grade nuclear program in 10 to 15 years. This is a disastrous deal, and the message I want to send to you and to your viewers and to your guests right now is, I believe it is certain the U.S. is going to pull out of this agreement. And rather than argue about this disastrous piece of appeasement, we need to talk about post-JCPOA strategies. That's what we need to talk about, and I think we can get there and put together a much better deal that poses a comprehensive approach to the threat from Iran.
Let's open that up in the studio here with Paul Ingram for a start, because you look into nuclear deals or non-deals. What do you make of what Fred Fleitz has had to say? He says there's clear evidence that they are further enriching uranium, they have more centrifuges, and this is going to lead to the nuclear program, which America was so desperate to stop. Is that your...
Well, some of the things that Fred just talked about are permitted under the deal. So it is permitted to have 5,000 centrifuges enriching uranium. We have a much, much clearer sense of how much uranium is being enriched. Uranium is leaving Iran for use in other countries. We have a much better handle on the situation than we had 5 or 6 years ago, and that is the comparison that is relevant. We have a history over the last 15 or so years that we can step back and look at, and when there was no deal, when there was no negotiations, Iran was building up its capacity at a much faster rate than they are expanding today. In fact, they're not expanding at all. They're actually being capped and being held at a particular level of nuclear operations. Now, where Fred is right is about the missile program, but that was never part of the deal. So in terms of what the deal is intended to achieve, it is being successful, and the White House itself has confirmed
the agreement, which is what Donald Trump refers to in just a moment. I'll come back to you. We've got the basis for discussion here, but now let's talk about Iran itself. Since the first sanctions were lifted, I mean, you've invested heavily in Tehran. Have you seen a changed country?
I think the expectations were very high, and clearly the sanctions lifting and the economic impact is taking longer. But yes, Tehran changes every day. There's small improvements. The financial sector is still a problem because of the pressure from the US mostly. But you're seeing smart Iranians from the diaspora living in California, involved with in the Silicon Valley, coming back, setting up businesses. You're seeing there's a different vibe. And there's people that have voted strongly, overwhelmingly, recently for the more moderate candidate that seeks better relations with the West. So I think it's a positive evolution, and what the deal is doing is empowering the more Western friendly faces in the Iranian establishment.
But then we were talking about the election once again of the President Hassan Rouhani. He's referred to, I'm saying if I can bring you in here, he's referred to Donald Trump as intellectually unstable. So is that any way to sort of go about trying to get better relations with the new President of the United States?
Well, certainly not, but issue is that, well, I mean, even the supreme leader of the country, before and after President Trump's sent to the White House, said, well, we need to wait, and there may be ways to sort of work out differences. So Iran's original approach to President Trump's victory was not all negative. There was a mood of, let's say, anticipation of the possibility of improvement in terms of relations, not a detente, not, Yeah,
but he has said quite recently that relations with the US would be what he called a curvy road. Iranians waiting for the American government to become stable intellectually. Hopefully things will settle down, but the Americans don't know our region.
Well, He talks about the region, and he talks about sort of, let's say, fading hopes of any improvement. Not that Iran is coming forward with the olive branch in its hand, saying, well, let's get out of this situation and let's be friends. No, that's certainly not the case, because Iran would definitely want to strengthen its sort of power over the region, want security for itself, want to exert as much influence as it can in the region. But then I think a real question is, are we moving toward more clarity in the region and the future of the region and Iran-US relations and relations between Iran and the whole of the world, or are we seeing more uncertainty? I think that is the question. And any action that increases that uncertainty, I think, would be counterproductive.
Okay, Fred, let me come back to you, because we talked about, we listened to President Trump talking about this the Iranians being in breach of the spirit of the agreement. What do you believe the spirit to have been when it was signed?
I think that's a great question. The American people were told that this agreement would bring Iran into the community of nations. So the question now is, can we say, has Iran's behavior improved since 2015? And I think the answer is clearly no. There's been a 90% increase in its military budget. It's sent troops into Syria. It has stepped up harassment of shipping in the Persian Gulf. Missiles have been fired at ships in the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea by the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels. It's backing terrorist groups. Recently, an American graduate student was taken hostage. Now, I realize the nuclear deal is only supposed to deal with nuclear issues, although that's not actually true, because sanctions were lifted against Iranian terrorists in this agreement. But if we're going to take a holistic view of this, this agreement has not improved Iran's behavior. It's actually gotten much worse.
And I think that's something
President Trump is weighing, as well as Iranian violations of the agreement.
He believes that Iran is simply looking after its interests in the Middle East. Now, those interests may be simply protectionism for Iran, and they may be against American interests there, but is it a case to answer that that is all they are doing?
No, I think that's absurd. You mean harassing ships in the Persian Gulf, backing terrorist groups, sending troops into Syria is in Iran's interest? Iran would like to be a regional hegemon, and this agreement is helping it become one. That's why we need a new agreement. Look, I think there's no doubt Mr. Trump's going to back out of this agreement. We have to think about post-Iran deal strategies.
Right.
I'll come to Hussein in a minute, but Paul.
David, I don't want to take your job, but I want to ask Fred a question, which is, if we don't have the deal, what is his strategy? Because I'm confused. I don't know what the strategy is without, and Fred's just talked about a post.
Fred, you think on that one while we go around the rest of the table, because Hussein also wanted to say something. We'll come back to
Fred. Let's go back to December 2012. Iran issues the Islamic Republic. I think we can even make a distinction between Iran and the Islamic Republic about its people, which many people seem not to care about the private sector, business, prosperity of those people, but and helping them to pushing them towards hardliners. But December 2012, Iran issued a 6-point plan, sort of suggestions, proposal for resolution of the Syrian crisis. Part of it was, I mean, it started with cessation of all hostilities. Another part was establishment of a transitional government. So Iran was happy and ready to let go of Assad, of Bashar Assad. But what happened then? Everybody turned to Iran and said, no, we're not interested in this. We think that we can get rid of Assad and we don't need you. And then what happened? 2017.
Okay, look.
Different situation.
Everybody's got a different view on this, and we're talking about the Syrian conflict in detail, which I don't want to do on this particular program. We're going to talk about investment in just a moment, Clemente, so please don't think that I am ignoring you. But let's go back to the point that Paul made, Mr. Flights, if we may, in Washington, D.C. If you don't have this deal, what do you have?
We can have a comprehensive strategy that includes America's allies in the Middle East, something that looks at not just the nuclear program, but the nuclear weapons delivery program, missiles, Iran's sponsorship of terror, its efforts to destabilize the region. I think America's allies in the Middle East have to be included in a much broader strategy to address the threat from Iran. I think this is coming, and people who cling to this disastrous piece of appeasement, look, you're going to be disappointed because this agreement is going down.
Well, are those American allies in the Middle East people who hate Iran, such as Saudi Arabia, in this case Egypt, etc., 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 Paul?
Yes, exactly. So what I'm hearing is a strategy that is basically one of confrontation. It's based on the idea that a country like Iran, when it is confronted with a whole set of people against it, is going to cave and is going to accept the containment, and that is not going to happen. I know Iran well enough to know that that will play straight into the hands of people within Iran who are not nice people, who see this as an ideological confrontation, and it will push this conflict over the edge, and that will hurt millions of people, not just in Iran, but across the region. And if we think that we can predict the end of such a conflict with any confidence, then I can tell you for nothing, this will be really bad for the West.
Let's talk about the practicalities. Clemente, yeah, you wanted to say something,
no,
then I'll get on to what happens if they walk away from the deal to the financial implications.
Well, I mean, legally, and Paul is the expert, they can't just walk out of the deal. It's a multilateral deal. Yeah. There is a conflict resolution system, which is quite extensive, so it will take some time. They probably have different strategies in walking out of the deal. But going back just to Paul's point is also, I don't see, the basic point is, aside from moral issues, I don't see how a confrontation advances American interest. I mean, that's the key point. I think that a closer relationship with Iran is a win-win for, all the parties.
Well, would the European countries or those other people who have signed up to the same deal, even if Donald Trump says, I'm just not going to pay any attention to it any longer, would they follow suit, or would they say, look, sorry, we agree with so many people, including the State Department, it appears, that Iran is keeping to the deal?
Europe is going all in this deal. Asia, China, Japan, South Korea, India, the whole world is in favor of the deal. And American policy is really at its best when it manages to have a leadership position in the so-called free world. If it acts on its own, it's going to have a limited impact. And right now, what the Americans are doing is they're doing an embargo, which they're the only ones implementing that embargo. So it's a self-embargo vis-a-vis Iran. So I don't think the current American position is achieving anything.
Fred Fleitz, it appears that there's a bit of a war between the State Department and the White House about whether this deal should be honoured or not. And the Atlantic magazine reporting that it's not just the Secretary of State, it's also the Defence Secretary, the National Security Advisor, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who all think Iran is doing enough. Where do you think this is going to end?
Well, there has been a robust debate in Washington over how to proceed with the agreement, and I think when the president makes his final decision, it will be clear that he's heard all sides. A problem right now is that the White House has been slow to staff the government, and a lot of people at the State Department, for example, were put in place by the Obama administration and support this agreement. That doesn't mean they're right, but it means that people evaluating the agreement, many of them helped negotiate it, and they obviously have a bias. But I suspect that this is going to change because of a National Security Council evaluation that's underway right now.
Hussein, I wanted to ask you, within Iranian society, within the higher levels of people with power, there will be those who don't want this to work, who would be quite happy to see it all fall apart.
I'm not sure that there will be people who want the deal to fall apart, because basically right now we have two groups of, let's say, politicians in Iran. I would like to call them the integrationists and the interactionists. The integrationists, such as President Rouhani himself, they want Iran to integrate into global economy, to be on the same page. But interactionists, such as even Khamenei himself, I mean, Khamenei thinks, well, let's interact, let's do business, but, well, stay away from our internal affairs, that sort of thing. Collapse of the deal is not something that Iranian leaders want to happen.
But the more hawkish would be quite happy to see a less amicable relationship with the United States.
That's true. the hawkish ones, they want chaos. They want uncertainty.
And those are the ones I was referring to.
Exactly. Those are the ones who think, well, when there is chaos, then security becomes paramount, and then political activists cannot speak freely under the excuse of national security. And that was actually the case more than 10 years ago when Iran was branded axis of evil.
Yeah,
and
let's be realistic about this. In the almost 40 years that I've been covering events in the Middle East, it hasn't got any more stable at all. And so here you are encouraging people, Clemente, to put their money into Iran, and it's just as likely that one day they're going to want to get it out.
Well, let me put it this way. I think that when you tend to trade with someone, you don't tend to bomb them at the same time. So I think business is, well, first of all, there's great opportunities for foreign investors into Iran. It's not even about sanctions. It's about GDP. It's about demographics. It's about inflation, interest rates coming down. It's about a massive re-rating in the equity story. But that being aside, I think that if you start engaging with countries, start traveling there, meeting people, and having more interaction, whether it's business, cultural, political, then there is less scope for misunderstanding. I mean, I lived in the US, I go to Tehran regularly, and I can tell you that right now there is a huge misunderstanding between the two sides. And, you know, as long as people don't talk to each other, don't visit each other, then it will be difficult. Now, I think what this deal was trying to achieve is to say, look, through business, it will create some stakeholder on both sides that will be in favor of the deal, in favor of a normalization of relationship. Because ultimately, if you want to address Iran from a political standpoint, you really need to look at the politics. And if you want to reinforce a more moderate policy, then you have to engage with them.
Okay,
and that takes time.
Give me a chance on this one, because we're going to come to you, Paul, and to Fred to sort of sum this up in just a minute. But saying anecdotally, because I know you haven't been there for some time, but anecdotally, are people feeling the benefits of the deal? Because often when they do, they want to keep in power the people who have brought them those benefits, and therefore President Rouhani may well be more stable than he was 10, 15 years, well,
opinion polls show that Iranians are not very happy with the outcomes of the deal. They don't see the fruits of the deal actually ripening. That they don't see that happening. But still, they are hopeful because they think, just as the Iranians showed in the last presidential election, they think, well, this is the way forward.
Give them a chance.
And also, they do realize that, look. Revolutionary Guards, their share of the economy, or quasi-private companies which are affiliated to certain bodies in the state, their share of the economy has been growing bigger and bigger, not because sanctions were removed, but because of the period that Iran was under stringent sanctions. So they do realize that, and anybody looking at Iran from outside needs to realize that too.
Paul, your final thoughts on this? Where's it going to go?
What we've been talking about takes time, and we've only had 2 years the deal, and we've had over a decade of the previous relationship, which was no relationship, lots of shouting over a chasm. And a lot of the challenge and issue that we have today, I think, is partly a legacy of that, but it's also a legacy of a strategy of containment and hostility.
But a loosening of ties on Iran, would you agree or disagree that it makes it more likely that it could one day go down the nuclear weapons path?
Yes, I think that the temptation within Iran to go down the nuclear weapons route is very strong if it is seen that the only way of existing in the world with any sense of security is to threaten its neighbours and to threaten the United States. And the only way of doing that effectively in the long run is with nuclear weapons. They are learning from our own strategies. And if we deal with Iran in a way of using threat and hostility, it will drive them into that response. And I think instead what we need to be doing is drawing them in. And there are many ways in which Iran is inside the international community already, one of which is the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which I deal with, and the Iranians remain inside that regime. We can push them out of that and they can go down the North Korean route. That is not a route that is attractive at all to anybody.
Fred Flights, when Mr. Obama signed the deal with President Rouhani, they spoke on the phone in the car. They became very good friends. It was almost like they were swapping greetings at Christmas and Ramadan. Can you see any way in which Donald Trump is going to change his mind?
Well, I might add, nobody signed this agreement, but that's a technical issue. I think it's fairly certain that Mr. Trump's going to back out of this agreement, but Trump doesn't want war with Iran. He wants a good agreement. And those people who argue that Iran's behavior will get worse, it will advance its nuclear program if we get out of this agreement, Iran's behavior has already gotten worse. It's not just this U.S. graduate student who was sentenced to 10 years in prison for being, even though he's completely innocent. It's the fact that Iran is further destabilizing the Middle East since this agreement was announced. We need a better, more comprehensive approach. I think America has to work with its allies, and I believe that's the direction the United States is going.
Excuse me, Siamak Namazi. Fred mentioned without his name, Siamak Namazi. Siamak is a good friend of mine, and I begged him not to go back to Iran, and he would get into trouble. But he did go back to Iran because he thought he loved, well, he believes, I'm sure even to this day, he believes that he loves Iran. People like Siamak are suffering, and the number of Iran's proxies in the region are increasing, especially during the past few years, not because sanctions were removed, not because there was ease of sanctions, because of the very period that we actually, the message we sent to Iran was get tough, get more serious about the nasty business you're doing in the region, and that is the way we can reward you.
Paul, I know you want to say something, but it's my turn.
I understand.
Okay, because I have to say goodbye. I have to say thank you to all four of you, Fred Flights in Washington, to the three of you around the table. Appreciate your contributions to this round table. Since that 1979 revolution, Iran has been held at arm's length by many. The door, well, it appeared to have been opened, but could President Trump's administration succeed right now in slamming it shut once again? We shall see, and we shall talk about it again, I'm sure. From me, David Foster, and the rest of the team on Roundtable, thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.